It's a brand new metagame. Let's take a look through the best decks in Marvel Snap. Many people are going to be surprised to see a deck that looks like this at the very top of my list. I am not typically someone who puts the new hotness towards the top of it, but I do think I would be remiss if I did not cover this deck. Now, there are a couple of metagame concerns that make this deck as strong as it is right now, and I don't necessarily think that those will allow it to stay at the top of the metagame, but right now it is very, very well positioned against what people are playing for a few very important reasons. The first is that after the Attuma change, many people are playing Destroy, Nimrod, things of that nature. Being able to beat an Armor Cosmo deck against those decks is quite impactful. Cosmo actually has plenty of targets as well in other matchups. It's just normally been a little bit harder to get him into your deck because you have to account for his power being pretty minimal. This deck makes up for that by dumping big dudes on the board. Now, on to that section. You'll notice that I've named this deck No Fart Zone, and for the record, it was cooked up by Batman, I believe. So shout out to Batman. Not Bruce Wayne, the player, Batman. Now, this list is built in a way that necessitates and sort of obliterates every Alioth deck. It is very hard for an Alioth deck to meaningfully interact with what this deck is doing, because what it's doing is saying, look, other decks, they play undercosted cards with on reveals that make them bigger than their cost. They're playing Sage, they're doing things like that. Alioth is really good into that. Our stuff happens in our hand. So, if you're an Alioth deck and I'm playing 20 power on the final turn of the game, I'm coming out ahead here because I'm playing like Mockingbird Scar and you're playing a 10 power Alioth that does absolutely nothing. Now, I should be super clear here. This is a deck that has some extremely defined weaknesses. The card Mobius and Mobius ruins it, obliterates it, takes it out behind the woodshed. But until the metagame adjusts, this has been mine and many others' most successful deck at the current moment. I can't really say anything other than that because, again, very defined weaknesses. Mobius stuff will beat you. You do not interact with a lot of stuff well. There are decks that can combo over the top of you. I have seen this list running something like Shadow King instead of Marvel Boy. That is a really good way of dealing with at least some of the things that can typically go over the top of you. However, the raw power this deck brings to bear, the ability to just play a bunch of power, and the general lack, and I think this is another important metagame consideration, is not that there's no Shang-Chi, but that when you look at the decks people are playing, these Wiccan piles, there's no Shang-Chi in that. The Bounce decks, there's no Shang-Chi in that. Arishem, there is Shang-Chi in that, but it's one of 27 cards. And so you end up in a situation where it's like, wait, I feel like my turn 4 Arishem, my turn 4 10 drops are just getting Shang-Chi'd way less than they were in basically every other metagame we've ever been in. That is the third thing that is making this deck feel well positioned right now. Any of those things change, and this is no longer doing what it does. We are now entering the Wiccan section of this tier list. Let's talk about all of the decks that are playing Wiccan and the various packages that they are using to try to gain an advantage. We're going to start with the Butt list, which I think is a good deck at leveraging Wiccan, but not in a way that leaves it vulnerable to everything. This is also a list that has a lot of surprise in it still. There are confusing and weird turns that actually end up happening a lot in a deck like this, and I think this is important, you have a flex slot in the form of Red Guardian and in the form of Speed. You are not locked in to playing those cards specifically. You could play Red Guardian and Cosmo. You could play Mobius in one of those slots. What I like about this deck is that it is customizable to what you want to actually try to deal with. And the 3-drop slot right now actually has a lot of customizations that you can make. This is a very reasonable deck to just take this, customize it to what you're trying to beat, and then go out and beat it because the backbone of this deck is strong, surprising, and powerful. Lady Deez, I think, is a little less flexible by virtue of being a sort of clog-focused deck. The 3s are not really swappable. You can maybe swap speed, but you want to swap it for something with power. You have this Lady Deathstrike thing that is a very good card still, don't get me wrong, but if people start going towards things like Atuma's, she's kind of completely embarrassing. I think there's a lot to be said for a deck like this. It's a good baseline expectation. If you just want a good deck to play, this is a good deck. But keep in mind that this is the exact kind of deck that the No Fart Zone deck that we talked about at the beginning is trying to beat. This is a deck that has a meaningful target on its back, and it is very difficult for this deck to actually interact with the No Fart Zone deck. How do you beat a 10 power dude on 4, a 10 power dude on 5, and 2 10 power dudes on 6? You kind of mostly don't. It's really hard to do. And that's to say nothing of everything they were doing in the earlier turns of the game. Just 4, 5, and 6, you run into trouble. They're Marvel Boying some 1-drops, now you're really up against it. In light of that, I think it could be time to return to Wixie. Wixie was mostly supplanted by Loki Wiccan decks, which were mostly better, but I think that right now there is some real value in being a Mobius deck. And I think that being able to have that Mobius built in a world where people pick up that first deck we talked about and have the same success with it, that I think they will have. We have to start considering, how do I sort of insulate myself from that? That deck folds over and dies to Mobius. It's a very good thing then that you can be a Mobius deck in this shell. The Wiccan shell is flexible and powerful and can accommodate a wide variety of different strategies within it. This is one that I think might be under the radar right now, but when I'm thinking about how to try to beat that first deck, which I have to be now that I've made this video, it is the first thing that comes to mind. This is going to sound weird, but I have been playing a little bit of Wiccan Bounce, and I think in this deck specifically, the beast change was a buff because it makes me feel like I'm more likely to use all my energy on those turns. Like, now the curve makes more sense, right? We've got like more 3s, our 1s give us other 1s, our 2s are very good. Like, it almost straight up makes a ton of sense now, because what used to happen was like, oh, if I have to curve out my beast, I'm not getting any value off of it. It super sucks. It is discounting a thing, so I don't even get to like stay on curve for my Wiccan. I know this sounds ridiculous, but I think the beast change was a buff specifically in Beast Wiccan because it fits the curve better now and allows you to just, like, worst case scenario, if that's what your hand is telling you to do, you can actually just play a 3-5 into a 4-7, 2 extra energy, and actually just execute the game plan that way. It's not something that's necessarily good or that you're happy about doing, but it's definitely meaningful because in that situation in the previous metagame with the previous beast, your choices would have been do nothing, and now you actually can do something. I know it sounds weird, but I do think that this deck might be worth reinvestigating. I think it was very solidly, like, at least not very worth playing previously because the Loki decks were just so much better than it. But now that the sort of Wiccan shell is more in flux, it's possible that there's some real upside here. One of the major things this deck really does well is just output points in meaningful ways. I felt like it was doing some strong, powerful things. I can't be sure if it is an actual upgrade to Fuse, Bounce, and Wiccan, or if what's happening is, you know, it's very hard for a deck with all these good cards to actually be bad, and we'd be better off playing one or the other. I think that is something that time will have to tell, but I was more successful with this than I thought, and I do think there is a reason for that. I have been messing around with Arishem, and I'm gonna be honest with you, I haven't found anything super compelling. I actually enjoy playing the deck, but it doesn't really feel like it's meaningfully far ahead of the competition at this point, and I also really do think it's important to note that Loki kind of got nuked in this deck. I realize people are walking around, or I guess going on Twitter, typing around, and saying, I got turn 1 Loki, this deck is still broken. Dude, turn 1 Loki is so much worse than the old turn 2 Loki. It's actually just 3 power worse for less of what you would otherwise get. It's 3 power and a drawn card worse, too. Like, this is, like, not necessarily always snappable, and it very much depends on, like, what your hand actually looks like. it's like snappable in mirrors and against decks where like you really know you're getting good stuff. But if you're like snapping Loki and they end up playing like a bounce deck and your opening hand was like Nick Fury and 2 randomly generated cards, you're just like, oh my god, this sucks so bad. One of the other things that I've really been feeling in Arishem recently is like, I feel like I need more stuff that gives me stuff, and that is not a feeling that I like. Like, I don't like it. It's not fun for me, but I think like Loki was really subsidizing some of the maybe like suboptimal deck building decisions people were making, where it's just like, this is now a deck where it's like, it kind of has to be built like this, but you brick so much, and the bricks are more meaningful now because your bricks are so bad. And it used to be that Loki was so good that when you bricked, who cares? But you don't have that anymore. It's not the same nut draw. It's not the same auto snap that it was. It's just a much worse card. And I think that there are going to be way more scenarios where like it's just okay and not a guaranteed snap than there were previously. It's going to be way more dependent on like what's in your actual opening hand. Do you have like some relevant tech cards? Do you have a big guy or whatever? Because getting rid of your deck actually does come with a cost now, and it's something that legitimately does matter. Zoo is actually just a phenomenally powerful deck. I feel as though people are sleeping on Zoo because it's like simple or easy or whatever, and right now, I can't think of a good reason to sleep on Zoo. I think it is just a very good deck that outputs a large amount of points at a very consistent level. And being a deck that does that in a metagame like this one, which has just been, in my opinion, meaningfully depowered, and people are still trying to figure out what they need to do to respond to that depowering, meaning that you get to play basically a perfectly tuned list while your opponents are still messing around. Zoo is a really good choice right now. And I think many people who are going to be looking at this are going to be saying, okay, Cam, I can play Zoo, I can't play Hydra Bob. You're good. Just put Kyera in. You're fine. Like, you're good to go. You don't need Hydra Bob for this. You can play Martyr. You can play Kate Bishop. You can play Kyera. You can also swap out Shadow King for Kyera. You got options here. Those are the spots you can really play around with. You can have, like, they're basically like 5 cards that go in there. It's like Shadow King, Kyera, Kate Bishop, Martyr, and Hydra Bob for the 2 slots that are currently in this deck, Shadow King and Hydra Bob. Do whatever you want with that. Go nuts. I'm not gonna like judge you about it. You can do whatever you want. This is a perfectly capable, genuinely very strong deck that is already very close to having a perfect 12. There is no experimentation to be done. There is just points that you put on the damn board. Sandman is the same deck you remember it being, and you can do the same things with Sandman that you remember being able to do. If you want a perfectly serviceable, turn your brain off and climb deck, Sandman is that deck. Make sure that you are snapping not on the Sandman turn, and especially try to make sure that you are disguising the deck that you are. I think Captain Marvel might be a little bit too big of a giveaway in terms of what your opponent is expecting. Nebula, a little bit of a giveaway. But if you're just playing like White Widow, Kate Bishop, Copycat, they have no idea, and the Sandman should catch them off guard. Being able to have those games where your opponents are just like literally clueless that they're about to get Sandman is a big part of why this deck is actually good, because you need to be winning those games by a reasonable margin in order to make up for the games where that isn't happening. Now, the other thing this deck does have going for it is the ability to just be a points deck. It's not amazing at it. It's not the best in the game at it. It's going to be worse than a Wiccan deck when the Wiccan deck hits, but it's okay. Like, you can win games by curving out, playing Claw Ultron. You can do that. That's a winnable game. And so you have this deck that has this Sandman moniker, right? Like, it's about Sandman, it does that. But underneath the surface, it's actually just a good cards deck that does what good cards decks do and meaningfully puts points on the board in a powerful way. Pretty straightforward. The change to Attuma has led to some widespread adoption, or at least attempts to make him a reasonable card. The one that has stuck out to me as meaningful is simply replacing the card Deathlock in the basic Destroy deck, because this gives you a bigger guy who can be used multiple times in order to achieve the effect you need out of a Deadpool getting killed a couple times. That's just really, really good. this card being meaningfully bigger is really, really interesting. There are upsides and downsides, but I do think that on the whole, it is possible that this ends up being a genuine upgrade for the Destroy deck. Now, the other thing that Destroy decks have going for it right now is the card Killmonger. There are just kind of a lot of decks that are meaningfully weak to Killmonger. Like I did say, I think Zoo is very good. Now, they can run Kyera, but we also have the Marvel Boy deck in the first deck that we talked about, weak to that. There are bounce decks that if you can figure out the priority for it, you'll be able to Killmonger their stuff after it reveals. There's something to this card right now, and I think that's another reason why Destroy is in a reasonable spot. Finally, you'll note that we are running Shang-Chi. I genuinely feel like we don't have a choice about that, especially because Atuma sort of juices our Deadpool plan a little bit. It allows us to invest a little less in that kind of stuff, and it means that we are going to be more able to be like, Deadpool and a Shang-Chi final turn is something that is actually meaningful in terms of swinging 2 lanes. I feel like I've talked about how mid a lot of these decks are into Shang-Chi, or at least how decks are taking advantage of the relative lack of Shang-Chi. I feel like to me that means it's the right time to run him, but I mean, you could run Zola or whatever. I think that would be fine too. We've talked about Bounce Wiccan, but the good old-fashioned straight-up bounce deck is honestly probably also totally fine. This is a perfectly acceptable, good, strong, powerful points list that has been built well enough in order to maintain, despite the fact that it's a bounce deck that loves throwing Prio on turn 5, its ability to beat Arishem decks thanks to the card Sasquatch. Now, is that a guarantee? No, it's not a guarantee. You can still lose these games. Definitely can. But you are going to be meaningfully better equipped to deal with them. I would describe this deck as almost perfectly mid. It's not bad. When you play against this deck, you are playing a real game of Marvel Snap. I don't know if it really makes it up to the top tiers of the metagame, but it is absolutely competitive with them and can do a lot of point allocation. A smart player with this deck is one of the scariest things to play against in the entire game. The legendary High Evolutionary Just for Abomination deck is a very strong option here, but there is something to the idea that the metagame that this deck dealt with best is now no longer the metagame we're in. Let's talk about what I mean by that. When I talk about the metagame this deck dealt with best, it was very good against a metagame of small ball clog decks and then Alioth decks. Sometimes those overlapped. Lady Deez is a great example of the kind of deck this deck beats. The bounce deck with a clog sub package is the kind of deck this deck beats. Now, how common are those now and what has changed? The interesting thing that this deck was able to bring to bear is similar to what we talked about with the first deck. This is a deck that has big guys in the hand. It is not reliant on reveals and thus is better into a card like Alioth. Now, it can be vulnerable to Alioth if you're opting for like a turn 6 hazmat or whatever, but you are able to do things that can beat Alioth decks and make them look stupid for playing the Fart Cloud in the first place. The real thing to understand about this deck is the key card is Hazmat, and the more I play it, the more it is absolutely never a card I want to save until turn 5 or 6. This is a card I want to get out as soon as I absolutely can, as soon as I'm able to discount that Abomination to the requisite amount, because once you have discounted the Abomination to the requisite amount, suddenly you are cooking with gas, but it also unlocks, say, if you curved out Mysterio Debris Hazmat, suddenly your Annihilus is sending over 2 things in every lane. One of them may be the real Mysterio. It doesn't matter at that point. Like, that's what this deck is about. It wants to use its turn 5 and 6 after having hazmated. Yes, it makes your Ajax smaller. Yes, sometimes that's not true, but on the whole, that is how this deck operates. Silver Surfer is a perfectly functional deck, and frankly, I feel as though it's become underplayed at this point. I realize that there are issues. I realize that maybe we should be swapping in a Mobius and all of that, but what I'm really putting this deck on the tier list to do is to ask you, the audience, why aren't you playing Silver Surfer? I feel like it's fine right now, and I get it. Maybe there's like a lot of decks that are fine, and people are just going to play the more exciting ones or whatever, but like, I get a lot of comments that are like, oh, I can't play any of these decks because I don't have any of the cards, and I feel like people are going to say that about Silver Surfer, but it's like, okay, replace Copycat, you can put Mobius in there, that might even be better. Replace Nocturne, you will be fine. Replace it with whatever. There's so many replacements you can make for this deck that I honestly feel like it might genuinely just be like a solid, reasonable budget deck at this point. I don't know that it is, But other than Cassandra Nova Absorbing Man to make sure you have an Arishem matchup, it's hard for me to look at this and be like, you have to have any of these cards. Like, it's just solid. It's just a solid deck. And right now, actually, I feel like there's more, not necessarily experimentation, but like, we are able to set up situations in other decks where Cosmo and Mobius are very good. I wouldn't be shocked if that was able to be true in here, too. Like, we're playing Speed, and Cosmo, and Mobius, and Red Guardian, and all of this stuff. And I feel like people get really caught up in looking at the exact list I put on there and saying, oh, I don't have Copycat, it's unplayable. Anything but. I think people have sort of gathered how this deck is meant to play now. Like, there's less people that I see who are just like turn 4 daggering and just throwing the entire game by doing that. One change you will have noticed is I have deferred to Yo Woody. I am no longer playing Beast. I am no longer playing Hobgoblin. There's a Copycat in here now. So what we're going to do is trust the guy who originally made the deck on that. So shout out to Yo Woody for that. Now, this deck is pretty much the same as it always has been. It's just a little bit more obvious what's happening. However, the proliferation of like Ajax-y decks has meant that this deck almost gets to like fly under the radar just a little bit, where this deck, if your opponent knows what you're doing, is a lot more vulnerable than if they don't. So the less your opponent has a grasp on, oh, I get it, they're gonna like Hazmat, Iron Fist, Ghost Spider, Dagger, right? They're gonna like Hazmat me and then play 24 power on the Dagger. The less they understand that, the better. And because there are so many Ajax decks, and we've talked about several, this is a deck that sometimes gets to fly under the radar until those final 2 turns when people are like, oh, that's what's going on. I've lost the game now. Now, it is a deck that is meaningfully hurt by what we would charitably describe as the Alioth meta, but it's not necessarily something that's not a permanent state of affairs, is what I would say. This deck has consistently had phenomenal stats on trackers, and yet every single person that I know in the top 10, including myself, thinks it is absolutely terrible. Let's talk about why, let's talk about what that discrepancy is, and let's talk about what it is that people love about this deck and what it is that people hate about this deck. To me, the discrepancy is because the people at the top of the ladder don't struggle nearly as much with Arishem as people everywhere else seem to. You can see this in the sort of conversations that happen around Arishem in the general player space of Marvel Snap. People get very, very upset about the card. They're like, I got turn 2 Loki. Oh my god, it's not even really good by my standards right now. It's like an okay, solid, fun deck. I enjoy playing it. Like, you know, sue me, I enjoy playing Arishem. But like, this is a deck, Goon Knight, that is possibly the hardest counter in the game to Arishem. Arishem is a deck that has a bunch of extra cards in its deck, making it weak to Darkhawk, making it weak to Cassandra Nova, and this deck discards cards from the Arishem player's hand, which, if they're not generating cards, is really, really bad for them. They can really struggle to use all their energy if they are not putting cards in their hand, if they are not doing things that are highly impactful, and costing them cards while also going at the throat with cards like Darkhawk and cards like Cassandra Nova. Like, while having all of this available is just very strong into Arishem. That is why I think the main reason why people are fans of it. Because not only is it a good Darkhawk Cassandra deck, it's a Darkhawk Cassandra deck that Moon Knights and Black Bolts away cards like Shang-Chi and Shadow King, which are good into those cards, right? So that's really important, first of all. The second thing that I think like that good players don't like about this deck, but that other players might actually not notice, is that if you ever play against it, you know there's no tech cards in it. There's no Shang-Chi coming out of Goon Knight. There's no Shadow King coming out of Goon Knight. Nothing in this deck is a surprise. It's just numbers. It's just numbers and disruption, and that's it. That's the only thing that this deck does. There's no interaction. It's just numbers and then the cards in your hand and whatever they've done to disrupt the cards in your hand. That's kind of interesting to me, but what it does is sort of make the deck play face up. There's not a lot of differentiation in their turn 6s. Oh, okay, they Black Bolted me. I need to play around Darkhawk and Stature. Okay, let's do that. Oh, okay, they Darkhawked me. I need to play around Black Bolt and Demon. okay, let's do that. Like, I think the main differentiation between, like, the reason so many of my friends think this deck is so ass is because it's incredibly face-up. It might be the most face-up deck in the entire world. And that is the kind of thing that a good player takes advantage of, but not every player will. And so the fact that this deck is as successful as it is due to these two factors. Like, that's what the gap is between why good players hate it so much. Why, like, everyone I know in the top 10, again, including myself, is like, this deck is so mid. It's so mid. It's so mid. It's so mid. It's so mid. You go to Untapped, it is like one of the best decks in the game. So let's talk about why that is. I hope that explanation was helpful. So this deck is the reverse. It is a deck that put 3 players in the top 10, but I am very cautious of it because when you look at the stats for it on Untapped, they are not good. 50% win rate, negative 0.02 cubes. This is a deck that I think is, to my mind, just extremely metagame for the top level of Marvel Snap. And I think that, like, there's a degree to which people criticize my videos for being super metagame to the top 100 or whatever, as if that's not more accurate rather than less accurate. And I think a lot of the time, I think that, like, that critique is kind of bunk, right? Like, my videos are talking about a different metagame than yours because more people are trying and they are better at the game, ergo my metagame is probably a little bit more reflective of what optimization would be. The fact that you are in a metagame that is different is more down to the players at a different level having different constraints, whether they be on budget, whether they be on time spent playing, whether they be on how many decks they recognize, or what cards they own. Generally speaking, I think that I would trust a high-ranked player in terms of that more than I would trust a low-ranked player. People like to talk about high MMR like it's a bubble, and I really think that, like, that's sort of misunderstanding the situation. Everywhere is a bubble. You are never going to have the exact same experience over a small sample size as anyone else. That is just how sample sizes work. And I think this deck, though, makes me feel like that actually is true. So a lot of the time, I will be like, that's bunk for all the reasons I've talked about. There's no such thing. This deck is a bubble deck. Like, this deck right here is an MMR bubble anti-metagame deck that, yes, 3 people in the top 10 are playing, but it's just, like, so extremely metagamed for, like, exactly the things that very clever players are playing right now. And so this is a deck, it's like we're running Mobius, all right? We got Mobius so that we don't lose to the first deck we talked about. We got Luke Cage so we don't lose to that Wiccan deck with Luke Cage in it. We got a lot of power here. We got some surprise cards in terms of the 10s, right? Like, this is it looks weird, but this is a generic good cards mid-range deck that is hyper-optimized for a very specific metagame. And I'm not necessarily sure exactly how to go about talking about a deck like this and a deck like Goon Knight back-to-back, because they are very much opposites here. Goon Knight sees very little success at the very top, but a lot of success throughout the rest of, like, Marvel Snap, right? Even when you sort by top 10% infinite, which, you know, 10,000 people or so, I think, at this point in time, Goon Knight will have better numbers than this. And yet, 3 people in the top 10, a bunch of people who are very good swear by it. I think this is a genuine case of, like, bubble deck. This is an actual bubble deck. Normally, I think, you know, that's bull. I think this might be one. Now, that's not to say it's bad. I actually think this deck is really strong right now. It's just a very powerful, very strong thing to do. It's good. It's hard to play against. It's very surprising. There's a lot of power output. You're very confused every time you run into anything. There's a lot of tools to adapt to every situation. But it's like your classic good player deck where it relies heavily on play skill, on recognizing what matchups you're in, on understanding the ways in which you need to interact with those matchups. Your strategies will change from matchup to matchup, and that means that it can be a little bit difficult to play. Mr. Negative is exactly the same as you remember it. I did notice that nobody posted the inane comment of, hey, Taskmaster got buffed in Mr. Negative. So thank you for not doing that. I really appreciate it. I really, truly appreciate when you keep my comments slightly saner. Thank you so much. Now, this deck is the same as you remember it. There are not enough people playing Mobius to make this a genuinely bad choice. Your decision-making is roughly the same as it always has been. You are snapping aggressively, and actually, I think that there are less decks right now that are able to make you second-guess your snaps. I don't really know how to explain that, but it feels to me like the overall point threshold of the game is like a little bit lower in a meaningful way that's like, people are playing these like, you know, I'm just gonna dump some power on you kind of decks, and it's like, you beat the crap out of those. And so like there is something to this deck for me, I think right now, that is actually fairly attractive. I wouldn't expect to have a positive win rate with it, but I would expect to be able to go positive on cubes. Phoenix Force remains Phoenix Force. It is perfectly acceptable. I would argue that it is a deck that I think a lot more people might be expecting now. Now, I'm putting this on here sort of as a byword for the other Nimrod decks. I realize that a lot of people are experimenting with like Shuri Nimrod stuff, All-in Nimrod, Destroyer, things like that. I have not seen one of those or played against one of those or played with one of those that felt good enough or better than this. And so Phoenix Force is my sort of catch-all for the Nimrod decks here. I think that it is still the best of the Nimrod decks if I were to guess. But of course, you know, there are still evolutions to be made in a metagame that changed so recently. So this is my nod to maybe there's something in the Nimrod decks, something there that I have not gotten to yet. I doubt it, but we will see. Honorable mention goes to Stefan's Sandmanless Sandman. You may remember when we talked about Sandman specifically. Sandman is a deck that has a built-in good core. This is a deck that takes that built-in good core and adds some cheating to it. One of the things that should strike people about Sandman decks is, hey, wait a minute, all of those cards are just insanely good. Like 8 months ago, this would have just been a flat good cards deck before the Scalers came back, before we got Thena, before Angela got reverted, before we got access to cards like Werewolf again. That would have just been like the dominant form of good cards deck. It would have looked a lot like this. And in addition, this deck has Pixie Mobius. I am kind of a fan of Pixie Mobius right now because of how scared I am of the first deck we talked about. We'll see if that ends up being an overreaction right now, but this has been very successful for Stefan, who managed to unpump an entire season of playing Pool 2 decks all the way back into the top 100, which is honestly like a 600 SP climb. Granted, he is a better player than the people he was playing. He probably should have been at those ranks already, so I'm not really sure exactly how much that reflects on the deck. But when I played this deck, it was also pretty good for me. It has the confusing output of a Pixie deck, the ability to play Mobius, and generally just strong cards to put into the board. The Be Back discard list, and I got it wrong last time, but I have it right now, I believe. This is a perfectly playable, acceptable discard list. I see absolutely nothing wrong with playing discard. It's a strong enough deck to see play. It is good, it is fun, it is easy. Although, I do think to some degree the ease of it is overstated because a lot of discard games, to me, come down to turn 6 reads. I almost think that, like, while it is easy in terms of decisions per turn, those decisions end up really mattering a lot. There's a lot that goes into playing discard. I don't consider it the most successful deck, but it is a deck that, to me, stresses the fundamentals of your Marvel Snap gameplay in a genuinely pretty fun way. This list was cooked up by Ika and hybridizes the Wong list that has some real power, but instead of being all in on Wong, is actually looking to be a little bit different, a little bit more unexpected, and still maintain that overpowering Wong game plan when you can. This is a very reasonably strong list that honestly I feel is a little bit underplayed, hence the honorable mention here. I think if you're looking for something a little bit off the beaten path that hasn't been fully explored, this might be a good option. All right, y'all, this is the final deck in this tier list, as ridiculous as that may seem. This is long as hell, this is crazy. And it's just a little bit alt on Sandman that I've been seeing get some traction. A lot of what I talk about with Sandman is how you want to make sure your opponents have absolutely no idea you're going to be playing Sandman. Your opponents will have absolutely no idea you're going to be playing Sandman. You have very powerful, straight-up points package here. Marvel Boy snowballs incredibly well. You will be ahead. You will play Sandman. People will be like, who the hell runs Sandman in that? And then you will win the game when they retreat. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. I have been KMB. I hope you enjoyed this incredibly long episode of the top decks. Thank you so much. Enjoy the KM boost, and I will see you in the next one.